5 minutes.
Yep.
Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'll move the mic a little closer here so I'm speaking out loud. They can hear me online. Thanks to John for letting us come talk about this today. I think this will be an interesting subject for the group. If you've been at our meetings the last couple of years, we've had quite a few discussions in our community about electric vehicles, the differences between those and conventional vehicles, and what those implications may be for roadside safety. Yeah, that's fine. So we've been fortunate enough to be able to conduct some tests on electric vehicles in the last few months here, and we thought it'd be good to update the group on what we're learning from that process. Just to get started, a little bit about the evolution of crash test vehicles over time. I think if you've been in this community for very long, you understand that we're constantly kind of chasing the vehicle fleet, trying to keep up with it. You can see that over time, right? Before my time working here, and that's been a while now, we were focused on sedan type vehicles and evaluating those with our hardware. As small cars came into view in the late 70s, early 80s, we incorporated those into the test specifications and the evaluation of hardware. And then more recently, we've had a lot of pickup trucks and SUV vehicles, larger vehicles, and so we're trying to incorporate those as well. So right now, the vehicles on the right side there, that represents what we use for MASH right now, which is a small car vehicle for the bottom end of the vehicle fleet, a quad cab pickup truck vehicle for the upper end of the fleet, and then we use a sedan vehicle for certain tests that we think are critical as well. So with that said, we think electric vehicles are probably the next step in that evolution. If you're tracking the proliferation of electric vehicles, it's been pretty rapid. We're keeping a pretty good track of it through some of the research we're doing. I think if you look right now, projections for this year are that electric vehicles will be about a little over 12% of vehicle sales just this year. That's up from when we did similar looks at that back in 2017. That was less than 1% of vehicle sales. So the numbers are going up. I think you've seen some recent news articles, probably that the trend is slowing down a little bit, but it's still going up pretty steadily. So we don't think it's going away, and that's kind of what the impetus and motivation for this research was. And I think when we talk about that, then there's going to be some pretty significant implications on how we deal with it in roadside safety. First being, it will probably change our full-scale criteria and how we what vehicles we use and how we evaluate hardware. And then it's probably going to lead to new roadside hardware developments in terms of how we design and design that hardware to save occupants out on the roadway. So we've covered a lot of this before. I'm not going to go into all the implications. I've given a couple presentations on that, but I wanted to kind of revisit a couple things because they'll play into what we saw in the tests that we ran. When we're looking at electrical and conventional vehicles, they are different, and largely that's the difference comes to the powertrains, right? Electric vehicles have an electric motor and then a very large and heavy battery pack. And what that leads to is a pretty large increase in the overall vehicle mass. So if we're looking at, for example, standard vehicles, passenger vehicles, four-door sedans, they on average for an electric vehicle are 20 to 30% heavier than a conventional vehicle. Maybe more significant when we really started to get concerned about electric vehicles is when we started to look at large electric vehicles, things that are going to replace pickup trucks and large SUVs. The masses for those vehicles are as much as more than 70% more than what our current conventional vehicles are. So that's a big change, right? And that's obviously going to put much higher loads, much higher demands on our safety systems. And so as an example of that, I've got a table there on the right with a picture of the Chevy Silverado, which is essentially analogous to the vehicle that we crash test right now. It's a four-door pickup. That vehicle is projected to have a curb weight for the fleet truck, which will have all the heated seats and all the bells and whistles in it, of about 8,500 pounds. So you're talking about a big increase in mass, and that's where the concern comes in. Another thing that plays into that, the mass for these vehicles is very low slung on the vehicle because it's on the batteries. Almost all the electric vehicles use what they call a skateboard platform. So that platform mounts a battery in between the wheels underneath the floor of the vehicle. That's great for stability. It does also change kind of the load path for our vehicles and how they're going to interact with hardware. So that's probably a significant change. The other thing that comes up with these vehicles is their structure and geometry. Obviously, when you take the whole front end of the vehicle and take out all the drivetrain components, that changes what you could do with the geometry of the vehicle. So one thing we're concerned with is the structure of the vehicles. The front end structure may change because the demands on it won't be the same. A good example of that, almost all these electric vehicles have what they call fronts now. They have front trunks because you don't have an engine and drivetrain in front of the vehicle. And then the other thing that comes into play is the geometry of the vehicles themselves. Because we don't have front drivetrain components, because vehicle manufacturers want to optimize interior space in their vehicles, and because aerodynamics has become a big factor in the efficiency of electric vehicles. There's going to be a big change in what those vehicle geometries look like, we anticipate. And some examples of that are shown on the right. This isn't all of them by any means, but the Tesla Cybertruck, I think everybody's seen pictures of that. There's a small car there in the middle from Europe, and then there's a pickup truck on the bottom made by a company called Canoe. These are all examples of new prototype electric vehicles that are coming out. The top and the bottom one I know are already on sale. Those vehicles are very different geometries than what we're used to, and that can also then affect how our vehicles interact with hardware. So that's kind of the impetus for the research that we've been doing, and we've talked about that with the group, over the last couple of years. We've been fortunate to have a partner that's allowed us to do some tests with electric vehicles on certain types of roadside hardware. The work I'm going to show today is specifically with the Midwest guardrail system, and we'll talk about why in a second. The work we're doing is with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Engineering Research and Development Center there, or ERDC. We've worked with ERDC in the past on some of their goals, and they've sponsored some more research with it. And part of that is looking at electric vehicles. So they've been generous to allow us to share this information with the roadside safety community because of the importance to the group and how we deal with things in the future. So the first thing to talk about with respect to the newer research I'm going to show is how do we select electric test vehicles. The electric vehicle fleet is a little bit limited at this point. There's not, we're still fairly early on in their adoption. So there's not as wide a range as there is with conventional vehicles to deal with. So what we were looking at isn't necessarily picking electric vehicles that represent the absolute most critical vehicle out there or some kind of, odd shape or anything. We were looking at vehicles that had kind of a representative, that had decent vehicle sales, and that represented kind of an analog to the current test vehicles that we have right now. So the first vehicle we chose was a Tesla Model 3. That's about a 3,800 pound sedan vehicle, small car type sedan vehicle. That's one of the highest selling EVs to date. I think the Model Y just outclipped it in the last year or two, but that's essentially the highest selling EV that's been out there for several years. And again, that was a nice analog to the 1100C vehicle. There are other small cars out there. This is slightly larger geometrically than our small car, but it's pretty similar. The other test vehicle that we looked at was a Rivian R1T. The Rivian represented a pickup truck SUV type vehicle. And again, there's very few of those out there, but what is out there is pretty massive. There's only 3 available EV pickup trucks. One is the Hummer EV. We thought that was going to be a stretch, right? That's 9,200 pounds and it's an extremely tall vehicle. There's the Ford Lightning, which was a conventional vehicle. We chose the Rivian because it was kind of in between those two vehicles in terms of mass. It also is a vehicle that was designed natively or from the ground up as an electric vehicle. So if we were going to learn something about structure and geometry, we should learn more from testing the Rivian. So with that in mind, then, we talked with Ernie about what system to test. We selected the Midwest guardrail system. Basically because we thought it would provide a really good barometer for where we're at with electric vehicles and roadside hardware. Essentially the most common guardrail system in the United States. So it's a good starting point, and it would give us a good idea of how those interactions between electric vehicles and hardware are working. We chose impact conditions that are essentially the same as MASH test level 3 to keep things a little consistent. And then we ran 2 crash tests. First, the Tesla Model 3 and the Rivian R1T. You can see the setup for the, we did close the hood, by the way. I got a question from somebody arguing. We had the hood open during the test. No, we closed the hood. We had it open for pictures and didn't catch it. The Tesla weighs, again, the curb weight for this, the test inertial weight was about just short of 3,850 pounds. The impact and the actual impact conditions of the test were 62.75 miles per hour and a 25-degree impact angle. And we tested the MGS in this case at its top nominal or its top tolerance for the mounting height, which is 32 inches. All of our small car testing in the past for small cars with the MGS has been run at that higher height because it's more critical. So to be consistent with the previous test, we use that. We also used 8-inch blockouts on this. We typically use 12, but we thought 8 inches is maybe a little more common across the country, so we use that for the test. Video of the test can be seen here. You'll see right away, this is not typical of what we see with the NGS test. I think you took vetting at the facility beforehand. We actually thought this test would work, right? Because we're talking about a vehicle that weighs 3,800 pounds. That's well within the range of what we tested for MASH vehicles with the NGS. What you see is it clearly didn't contain. We underrode the barrier relatively quickly in the event, and even this would be considered, if it was a MASH test, a failure of the system. Looking at it in a little more detail, another view here, you can see that we do get some initial capture of the front fender and bumper, and it starts to redirect, but eventually the rail pushes up on top of that fender, gets engaged with the A-pillar, and then have to hold on to it, and the rail continues over the top, and the vehicle penetrates through. We'll talk more. I've got some other information here on why we think that is, but just to get an idea of what we saw in the test. Vehicle damage, there were some pretty interesting takeaways from vehicle damage in this test. Three main things to kind of bring up for you. One, if you note the front structure of that vehicle, we'll talk about that more in a minute, you can see that the front bumper structure and the structure above the fender isn't what we typically have seen in small car vehicles. We think that played a role, and you'll see some more of that here in a second. But that was kind of a significant thing to take away from the vehicle damage. Another thing to note, the undercarriage of that vehicle is not what you're used to seeing in 1100C vehicles. That's that skateboard platform. We overrode at least 4 or 5 posts, strong posts in this test. We've seen in our community in the past that we overrode flange posts, there's a potential to penetrate the floorboard. You can see in the middle picture there's some pretty significant gouges on that floorboard. They did not penetrate the floorboard of that vehicle. That battery compartment is really stiff. Floorboard deformations and penetrations of electric vehicles may be a thing of the past. Their floors are very strong compared to what we're used to. And another thing, and this probably isn't electric vehicle specific, but we thought it was interesting. Both the electric vehicles I'm showing you today, we tested have glass rooms. That's not something that we've run into in the past. If that trend continues, that may pose challenges, not so much guardrail related, but more related with signs, luminaire poles. We have roof crush criteria. That'll be an interesting problem if all the roofs become laminated glass as vehicles move forward. Maybe they won't, but we thought it was kind of an interesting thing. So we wanted to talk a little bit. First thing we did, we saw the failure. We didn't expect the failure. We started looking at previous NGS testing as kind of comparison points. We had 3 relatively good comparison points that we had in-house to look at, and those were the original testing of the NGS to MASH, which is 2214 MG3. That was almost the same system, 32 inches tall, with in this case, a 12-inch block out, but it used the Kia Rio vehicle. So that's a good analog. And then we also had 2 very similar tests. We did some tests at maximum rail heights for the NGS after it was originally developed, and those were on 34 and 36-inch mounting heights. Those both redirected the vehicle, but we thought they'd provide then interesting comparison points for what we saw in the EV testing. A couple things to note right out the gate there. Inertial mass, we mentioned it, it's a big deal. It was likely a contributing factor to what we saw in that test. If the mass goes up as much as it did there, you see the impact severity goes up well over 50% for that impact. You know, that's not helping us contain the vehicle. We don't think it's the only factor, but it's certainly there. Another thing that comes into play, I mentioned CG height earlier. The CG heights on these Teslas are 4 to 5 inches lower than what we typically see in Kia. Again, is that the only factor? No, but it's certainly, if you're loading that rail significantly lower than you are with a higher CG height, the load path is different. It makes underride a little more likely, right? So to look at these tests side by side now, you can see a little bit of difference in behavior. Again, obviously, the 3 tests with the Kia vehicles, they were all successful redirections, even with a rail that was 4 inches higher than what we tested with here. So that's interesting in terms of why we didn't get underride previous testing. If we look at some sequential views, for me, it's always easier to slow these things down. I like to make still pictures because I guess my brain doesn't work fast enough to get through when they're playing side by side. So you start looking at them, and right away, 50 milliseconds in, you can see that there's a lot more deflection in the test with the Kia than we saw in the test with not with the Kia, in the EV test that we saw in the Kias. That kind of makes sense, right? At the same time frame, we have more load. We're going to get more deflection. We also see, as we continue through, a little bit more rotation of the rail, twisting of the rail. In all the tests, the rail tends to rise up on the vehicle to some degree, but we saw a little more twisting of it in the EV test. Again, as it continues through, the biggest difference is on the tests with the Kia vehicles, the rail largely stays vertical and maintains itself on the side of the vehicle on the sheet metal. And we also get some of the roll of the vehicle away from the barrier. With the EVs, we don't really see that. The EV test, we don't really see that. And what we get is the rail protruding or proceeding up the fender until it gets on the A-pillar, and then underride the rail, and get a very different performance there over time. So with that in mind, then we started looking at, well, what are some of the other things causing the differences besides the mass and the CG height? We started looking at the geometries. Obviously, the geometries of these vehicles appear to be a little different. And again, this is just one EV. This may not be indicative of all of them, but it is the one that we evaluated with. First thing we did is we started looking at side-by-side views and measuring some relevant points. So we took measurements at the center of the headlight, the center of the wheel, and the base of the A-pillar, and measured essentially the vertical profile of the front of the vehicle at those points. And kind of across the board there, the Tesla vehicle was essentially 1.25 to 2.5 inches lower than what we saw for our existing 1100C vehicle. Is that, again, not the only factor that played in, but a lower geometry certainly doesn't help in containment, so it's a factor. And you can see that when you park those vehicles side by side, and you can see it's got a lower nose, lower front profile, a little more aerodynamic than what we're used to in our current test vehicle. Another thing that comes into play is that vehicle structure. Again, you get an idea there. The front end of the Kia is largely an open structure, both in the trunk area and on the fender well and on the sides of the bumper. That's different than what we see when we have engine and drivetrain components in there. Structurally, the vehicles have to be built different to contain those structures, and there's more structure out to the sides of the vehicle, I think, than what we're seeing. I think there's also been some differences in crash testing that have led to that. We're talking to some of the auto manufacturers about that right now, and we're still looking into that. Maybe a better way to look at that is if we look at post-test damage from those tests that I just showed. You can see the damage that I already showed on the Tesla up at the left there. When you're looking at similar damage in 3 different guardrail tests with that vehicle, you can see obviously you have a more vertical side structure that engaged the rail in all 3 of those tests. You can see where the W beam actually engaged the fender all the way across in those tests. The other thing you can see is the amount of structure in front of the front wheel there is really different. You can actually see frame elements in front of the front wheel on the Kias that really doesn't exist in the Tesla. So clearly the structure we think is playing a part in what we saw in the test as well. So maybe to wrap up the first test there, obviously we had an underride penetration in the Tesla Model 3 test of the NGS. And that was with a conveyor system that essentially already redirected 1100C vehicles at higher heights. So an interesting result to say the least. I've mentioned all these before, but just to reiterate the potential factors we think that are playing in there. Obviously the increased inertial mass, 1,400 pounds, plays in. That's not going to help with containment, but we have contained vehicles that large before. The lower CG changes the loading of the rail to some degree. We see the lower front end geometry and structural differences is playing a bigger part maybe than we had originally anticipated. And that's been probably the most interesting aspect of what we're seeing with the tests that we probably weren't as concerned about early on. With that, then, we think it's a combination of those factors that are leading to it. There's probably a lot more research that needs to be done, but fair it all out. Yeah.
What about 12-inch and 8-inch? Use 12-inch on all the Kias and 8-inch on the Tesla. You think any difference?
Yeah, I don't think that makes a huge difference. If anything, the taller, the deeper block out tends to hold the rail up longer. So as far as that goes, I don't think it would actually hurt us in terms of containment here, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Yep. The next test we ran was the Rivian test. Again, this is simulated, MASH impact conditions. We impacted at 62.3 miles per hour, 25 degrees. The Rivian itself here weighs just less than 7,000 pounds. That 7,000 pound weight earlier is a function of which battery pack you get. For all test labs looking to run these tests, this is easily the most expensive vehicle we've ever impacted. There's not a race car. This is easily the most expensive thing we've ever crash tested. I want to cry a little bit. Crashing an 85,000 pound pickup truck, or an $85,000 pickup truck will do that. Interesting. For this test, we used a 31-inch rail height because that's the nominal height for the NGS, more critical for the pickup. And again, we used the 8-inch block out. Different, but no better result necessarily here for the pickup truck. We ruptured the rail very early in the event here. We had a rail rupture about 86 milliseconds into the impact. So again, an interesting result, maybe not what we were looking for. Less surprising maybe a little bit this time. I think we thought the heavier pickup trucks would would be a really stringent test of the MGS. But as I go into it, you'll see maybe the causes aren't exactly what we thought they were going to be. We looked at the post-test damage on the rail, and there was some interesting marks just downstream of impact for the first post. A very deep gouge in the rail. That was interesting. The other damage in the rails, largely just a rupture. Another thing to note is the rail didn't actually tear its splice, which is where we typically see failures. It tore just at a post. You see why a little bit more here in a second. Again, I always have to slow things down so I can follow them. Looking kind of sequentially through what happened in the impact, we kind of forensically reconstructed what we saw. After impact, the first thing we see is that gouge that's on the front of the rail. That was due to the tire rim. You can actually, if you took the video, and I've got a giant monitor at work, and you slow that down and zoom in, you can actually see that gouge get created as the rim of the wheel goes along the lower corrugation. So that gouging is something we haven't seen a lot of, at least in W-beam testing. We've seen it some more in AGT testing and stiffer systems, but not so much in the W-beam, standard guardrails. The next thing we see is about 48 milliseconds into the event, that gouge now has proceeded right up to the blockout at the first post, and it creates a small tear in the rail there, right at the base of the blockout. So that's the initial weakening of the rail that we saw in the test. Again, not something that we see typically in guardrail impacts. We've run dozens of impacts with the MGS over the years, so is TTI and other labs. We haven't seen any issues really with that kind of stress concentration from a rim digging in, engaging a blockout necessarily on standards. As the vehicle keeps moving into the system, we see another behavior that's really non-standard. The guardrail started to extend between the fender and the wheel. This was a big contributing factor to what we saw in the event. Usually when we impact these, and you'll see it, I'll show some comparable tests here in a minute. Usually the rail engages along the fender and above the bumper of the vehicle, and that's really the capturing of the front of the vehicle. In this case, we didn't maintain that capture. The rail extends there in between the wheel and the fender. As it keeps going, now we have the rail all the way between the fender and the wheel, and now we're loading the guardrail on internal frame structures, the suspension. We can see, gouging and marks on those pieces. And that changes the loading of the rail. Now we've kind of snagged on something internally on the truck. And then shortly after that, just 4 milliseconds after that, we've got complete rail rupture. So I think we anticipated, higher load. We'd see an overload of the rail at some point in this event. But we think that there was other factors there that obviously contributed in that aren't just the mass of the vehicle. So again, trying to compare it back to some knowns. We've got a couple of different MGS tests here that are comparable. The one on the right there is a test, the original test of the MGS to MASH. The one in the center is a test that we ran for Illinois Tollway that involved a light pole behind the system. We do engage the light pole in the test, but it's near parallel time, so really it's a good comparison up until we interact with the light pole. Again, the big takeaways are look at how much more the impact severity is than what we see in a standard MASH test. And again, that was really the big concern coming in, is would Barry be able to contain a vehicle with that much energy being involved. Just to show kind of what those tests look like side by side. Again, pretty stark differences there. Obviously, in the two 2270p tests, we get stable and smooth redirection. That's what we expect in those tests. But then on the EV test with the Rivian, obviously that variant is a rail rupture that we already discussed. So obviously a difference in behavior. Then we wanted to look at, what causes that change in behavior. It's a little less enlightened maybe than what we saw in the small car, because the comparisons aren't quite as good because the event is only 86 milliseconds long. But you can see early on the event, at least, it looks like in all 3 cases there, we're getting, deflection of the rail, we're getting some engagement of the rail and the bumper and the fender, and we're starting to capture the vehicle. So it was pretty similar early on. As we continue in, though, you see that difference where once the rail gets sucked into the fender well there, that's a really different behavior. You can see that on a standard MGS system with the 2270p vehicles, that capture is really different. That guardrail stays flat and on the front of the bumper and the fender of the vehicle along the wheel. So it's a really different interaction there. And then, obviously once the rail ruptures, everything kind of changes. But we did a similar kind of geometric comparison with the Rivian, this is 3D scans that we've been taking of vehicles. When we look at that, there's not really a big geometric difference here. Not like we saw necessarily in the Kia and the Tesla. In this case, we're looking more at, very similar hood heights, very similar A-pillar heights, maybe a little bit lower profile across the hood, but not something that really probably played into that failure that we saw in the test. Maybe more playing into the failure, we started to look more at the structure. Again, this work's still ongoing, so I don't have all the things put together on this here. But you can see this is basically two pictures of the underlying structure of the Rivian pickup truck. And you can see it's quite a bit different than what we get with, I think, conventional pickup trucks. What you can see there is there's an upper frame member, and that's a kind of a body on white type frame member, and then a lower frame structure that's behind the wheel there. But above the wheel and directly in front of the wheel, there's very little structure in these vehicles, at least in the Rivian. We learn more. The black box that you can kind of see there on the views, that's actually the headlight assembly. So that's not really structure. That's just the plastic box sitting there. And the only really thing holding the fender out to the side of the vehicle is that bracket you can see there on the right that extends out from the main frame rail on the upper part of the truck. Again, we've been talking with auto manufacturers and some other groups about what's causing that. It may not be only an EV issue. It may have to do with their compliance with certain types of quarter overlap tests and things like that. So we're working through that. But clearly that's a different structure and we think it contributed. So again, on these tests, the primary factor contributing to rail rupture, we think factors contributing to rail rupture on the pickup truck test, where we had that initial rim gouge that obviously weakened the rail and created a partial tear. We do believe that vehicle structure between the upper and lower frame elements allowed the rail to extend in between those elements and really change the rail interaction with the vehicle. That affected capture, and it also changed the way the rail was loaded. And then again, the increase in a 50% increase in IS, and that's above anything we've ever, successfully tested with the NGS. That can be a problem. So, like we anticipated, I think electric vehicles are going to affect our hardware moving forward. Obviously, that's going to be an issue that we have to continue to deal with. For us, it's a good thing that we're dealing with it early on here. We're starting to get a feel for what's going on. I think the biggest factors we're seeing, at least following these tests, are that vehicle mass and mass distribution. They're playing in the low CG height. And body geometry and vehicle structure are likely more significant factors than I think we thought going in. So we're learning quite a bit about that. As far as future research or things that we need to keep looking towards as a group, I think we're going to need quite a bit more additional hardware evaluation with electric vehicles to understand this problem more effectively and figure out how to deal with it. That's not just testing more hardware system. That's going to be more vehicles. So again, we're really early on in the vehicles here, and I mentioned before, Chevy's coming out with 8,500 pound electric pickup. We're still 1,500 pounds short of that. So there's going to be more work that needs to be done with that. And then obviously, I think, we've shown some of this work to our state DOTs and the pool fund already. And their first question was, well, can we deal with this? And the answer is, yeah, I think we can. We can make new hardware that deals with this, but it's going to take time and effort to do that. So, and it's going to affect everybody, right? If we go out and we make a new guardrail system that can handle vehicles more effectively, that's great, but that affects terminals, transitions, everything else that's out on the road. So, and that's going to be across the board. So it's just something we wanted to inform the group about, keep everybody kind of in the loop where we're at, so we can kind of all keep plugging away at the issues. Just real quick, I want to acknowledge ERDEC again for their sponsorship and the funding to conduct those tests and their willingness to allow us to share it. Dr. Cody Stoley from our office isn't here this week, but he's the lead with the ERDEC work, so he's been instrumental in helping get those tests done. And the Midwest staff, our people are really good. This has been a challenge. Electric vehicles are not the same as towing conventional vehicles. They have their own new set of challenges, so our test site crew and folks did a great job getting those tests run. And that's all I had. If anybody's got any questions, I can sure take them best as I can.
Are you prepared to release this presentation to the House Transportation Construction Committee and Congress in Burlington?
I don't know anything about releasing it to Congress. We've already talked to FHWA and HITSA about it earlier in the week. And we're working with auto manufacturers too and informing them about it. So we're disseminating the information as best we can. Yeah.
Follow up. The Governor County provided $1 billion for incentives to Rivian. And are you saying that these incentives have made the entire barrier system extend to energy estimates?
I don't know if I would say that. Again, the Rivian is a vehicle that has something like 70,000 in total sales at this point, right? We're not talking about the number one vehicle in there, and this is super early on in the research. So what we're saying is there are concerns with these vehicles moving forward, and we need to learn to adapt them. I don't think, as a roadside safety group, we're doing research in this and trying to push the safety forward. In terms of, congressional funding and supplemental funding, that's outside of our purview. I would say that, it behooves us to keep looking into this issue. That's what we plan to do. But I also think electric vehicles are coming. I don't think they're going away. And so our job isn't really to decide, whether or not they come. That's outside of anything we can do. I think what we can do is try to prepare for it and help the DOTs and transportation agencies make the roadways safe if we can. Yeah.
Another thing to think about is Tesla. I think they're doing about electrical steering, which is more rigid than forgiving, or less forgiving than hydraulic assisted power steering. That would affect the Rivian, that wheel that came into the barrier, gouged without deflecting like hydraulic steering.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we did have to have these vehicles, the Rivian specifically, it has to be powered to tow it. It doesn't like to be towed above a certain speed. And most of these vehicles have kind of a neutral position on them. It's not neutral like we think of neutral, like when you disengage the transmission. But we had to look at that. And so the Rivian actually had to be powered on and kind of in drive. So we couldn't do that as a, in the standard way of moving to it. So it actually we had to have some minimal battery power in there. Yeah, I think we'll learn lots of things like that about how steering reacts, how stability will be different. All these things are going to come into play.
Hey, Bob.
There's a question online from Jason asking if the EVs were charged or discharged or what percentage they were charged.
For the Tesla, we had a minimal charge, as low a charge as we could get in it. And for the Rivian, we had to have a little more charge because, again, I just mentioned it had to essentially be in drive for us to tow it. We've taken the position, we're not here to evaluate the vehicles so much. So we've tried to minimize the charge in the vehicles to minimize the hazard to our staff. We talked about before about fire risk. So we actually had thermal cameras out and monitored those vehicles for days after the test to make sure that we didn't have hot spots flaring up on them right after the test or in the days following for that reason. So we kept pretty minimal charges in there. I think it's different when they do crash tests or NCAP. They have a charge requirement for that. We didn't follow that. That was much.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
But if the government done any analysis on driving in, and my question about that is, kept the compact saying driving about 6 inches lower. We're talking about 4 or 5 inch lower center of gravity.
Yeah. Yeah, if anybody didn't hear, he was asking about potentially the use of dry-beam as part of the guardrail system. We obviously don't have funding yet to redesign guardrail. So, but I think internally that's the most obvious solution that comes up, or at least the next step. Whether or not that's enough to do it, I think is the question. I think, because there's a capacity thing too. Dry-beam obviously will give you more capacity, won't be enough. But yeah, I think that'll factor in quite a bit. Yeah, I think that would be the next logical step, because rather than come up with a new rail that no one's ever seen before, that makes good sense. Next step, yeah.
There's another question online from Thomas. He was asking, in conversation with manufacturers, has there been any discussion of how the enhanced tech in these vehicles can play a role in this, like lane assist, self-driving, etc.?
Yeah, we haven't. That's a good question. We haven't talked much to the auto manufacturers about automated systems within the car and how that affects, how that can affect crash tests. Obviously, we think it can, but that's not something we looked at yet as part of this. That's your question. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on the Friday question, and I know it's early days, probably don't have the answers, but any consideration to whatever does come out of crash testing, crashworthiness is a great piece, something that can be retrofitted as much as possible once it's units.
Yeah, so again, like I said, it's really early. We don't have answers yet, but I know when I talked to the DOTs about this in December a little bit, that was their first concern, is like, we won't be able to put in all new guardrail everywhere. So I think they would like us to start looking at that on two paths, right? One will be, what can we do to retrofit barriers? And the other will be, if we had a clean sheet of paper, what will we come up with? So yeah, I think they will, I know the DOTs for sure are very interested in the retrofit option in that sense.
I think for both retrofit and new design, geometry plays a really important role, right? And for conventional vehicles, geometry sort of converged to some standards. But I think it is important to do a little research to see how the geometry is evolving for electrical vehicles, because I don't think they converged to a standard. So there might be huge variations that might really affect your design or retrofit. So it may not really work for one type, but it works for other type.
Yeah, I think that's, if you didn't hear his comment, he was just saying the importance of geometry, in this analysis, and that we don't know what the geometries are going to be, because I mentioned earlier, it's really early in EV adoption, right? In the sense, I mean, they're selling a lot more, but the variety of EV designs hasn't really kind of reached any kind of sticking point yet. So I would agree. The geometry was critical, it looks like, in these tests, and we're going to continue to learn more. So that's why it's important to kind of keep doing that research, I think, so that we do know which way it's going.
Just another comment. I think these Tesla and Rivian, they're using just not geometry, it's strength of materials, steel strength and other material. They're using some of the most advanced higher strength steel to pass for insurance rating.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the most.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Related to the driving and retrofit questions there, let's ask those, what were the things? So.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I think the question was that would a rub rail make a difference on the test with the Tesla? Yeah, certainly it may have. There's some, if back in the day when I was starting, rub rails were kind of a thing that people were evaluating. They had some problems with rollover or overrides with vehicles vaulting rub rails. So as a community, we've moved away from that. But you're right, maybe something we need to go back and look at is lower rail elements to try and contain these vehicles if the CV heights are significantly lower. Yeah. Yeah.
Jason, doesn't give them the billions of more already. Didn't get set going, that's fine. Interaction between rail and vehicles. Let's say. Say, find something on the contact. First, you got to figure out what's the thing about the. Well, you have the rental in the dark, okay, let it go, and the culture. You look at purpose to. Study to side. This is the
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Dean. If you couldn't hear Dean, what his point was essentially that this is a good chance for us to start doing more about vehicle compatibility with hardware, essentially, right? This is a chance for us to really move forward on that avenue. We've already started talking. We met with FHWA and NHTSA last week and showed them this material. We've already met with Tesla. We're going to meet with other auto manufacturers and try and drive that point home. We really need to get somewhere on that because it's going to be more critical, it looks like, moving forward. And so I think there's hopefully some avenues to do that. I totally agree with that point.
So. Not just the beds. It's a bigger. And you're able to do. You're on all time. Some people just need and they have this department of modalities, what they look at. And so we need to go like say at a time that we need to add things. vehicles. They don't grab them in the car, they use the guardrails. And, the right on safety. That's it. Yeah. I agree, it's a way to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, so how is the FMKSS? I mean, are they dealing with the same problem with this increased mass and lower staging, or?
They are. I don't think it makes the big, from just a sole vehicle safety standpoint. I don't think they're seeing the same problem. Matter of fact, these vehicles are largely safer than conventional vehicles from just a vehicle standpoint. For example, I mentioned floor pan. These vehicles perform exceedingly well in side impact testing because the side doesn't crush near as much anymore. So I think from NHTSA's perspective, standing here looking at it, they're like, these vehicles are great, and that's why it drives the point home. That's why we're talking about it now, is to kind of get that information out. Because there's other aspects of it, we're kind of smaller fish than what NHTSA deals with generally. And I think it's important that we start making that message that, look, we have a bunch of barriers all over the road that we need to start dealing with this issue with. So
At the same time, also ATSB has raised this concern. I mean, not just for the FMVSS, but like for pedestrians and others.
Yeah.
The heavier EVs are going to be the next big problem. So
yep, you just got
I
to
think this is the right time to.
keep pushing the message, right? Yeah.
I think Tim had more of a comment than a question, but he was saying, aren't battery designs evolving? Aren't they going to research and develop smaller and lighter batteries? Could this potentially lower vehicle weights?
Sure. So if you didn't hear in the room, the question was, are battery designs going to get lighter and more efficient? If I knew that, I would quit doing roadside safety and retire right now. I can invest in that. I don't have a good answer for that. All I can do is what we're doing now. I do think, if you read articles, I've been trying to keep up on some of these things. One of the biggest concerns with these vehicles is range. When they talk about these vehicles, they talk about range anxiety. So, it's a real thing. The biggest battery packs they have now get them about 300 or 400 miles. My truck will drive another 200 miles from that. It gets horrible gas mileage. So, I think people will keep asking. We've never seen vehicles get lighter in 100 years of doing vehicles. So if they get lighter, I'll be shocked. Maybe they will, but they haven't ever gotten lighter. I don't see them getting lighter. Yeah, go ahead.
Was your group also wants to look at in-service performance with those vehicles?
We had, Dr. Stoley did a brief study on the summer. It's really preliminary because almost all the data is California, right? Because they have by far the most vehicles. And he's looked at some really preliminary accident data for that. His initial findings were that he's not seeing a large difference between the number of impacts and the severity of the impacts between EVs and conventional vehicles. But he's also, almost all that data is smaller EVs. So it's not, the data set really doesn't have enough in it yet to draw a ton from, but we started looking at that. Yeah.
Another good question. Have you used finite modeling to guide you or, prepare you for these tests before they perform them?
It'd be awesome if we did. So we have access actually to a Tesla Model 3 model. We've started to look at it. Unfortunately, it's not unlike the folks at GMU who have years and years of experience building it for roadside safety applications. The one that we have access to does not. So, and it's a really great model. Structurally, it's really good, but the wheels and suspension and tires are very different. So we looked at it really briefly, but we haven't had a chance to incorporate it very, very much. We're going to try and do that. We got a project in pool fund that should start at the first of the year that'll allow and have some funding for us to start converting those models into something we can use for roadside safety. That's a good question. All right, thanks.
And invite any other comments or announcements from the group? Before we deconvene? So coming up next, we have a session at 1:30 at the Convention Center, room 101. So I'll see you there. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. It's been a pleasure serving with you. I'll be rotating off the committee as well, but I'll be looking for every opportunity I can to continue to participate. So thank you all for your support.
Way to show that.